Non-metallic metals is a technique that's usually reserved for a higher standard or like display quality miniatures, but I want to see if I can get the same or similar results with just dry brushing, something that is a lot more beginner friendly. And non-metallic metals is a technique where you render metal with typical or traditional paint instead of metallics. And because you don't have those little metallic flakes to rely on to make it look shiny, instead you have to hand paint on that really high contrast and those really bright reflections that make something look metallic. And this is really tricky. Something to keep in mind is that the reflections will always be facing the eyes of the viewer. They can sort of be thought about like little cameras with the light bouncing off of the object and back into the lenses or our eyes. And that's how all light and color works, but metal will have really bright reflective highlights. And that's how it works in real life, but these reflections can be kind of hard to place on a 3D miniature, so it can be helpful to hold your model up under a light once it's primed to get a better idea of how light falls onto it. And to paint the metal, we want a really wide range of values to capture that high contrast that makes something look metallic, but we also want there to be some color instead of going full grayscale. The rough plan is to have really dark grays, blues, and greens with some magentas for the midtones, while the higher values will be warmer oranges and yellows. But since overall we want a steel or silver look, we're going to want to knock these colors back a bit by desaturating them so we get an interesting and colorful look without that color stealing the show and looking too rainbow and pearlescent. We're going to desaturate everything by adding neutral colors like black and white, but also complementary colors to our mixes. These are the colors that sit opposite of each other on the color wheel, so that means that blue gets mixed with orange, yellow mixed with purple, and so forth. And I mix up a bunch of different hues and values so that instead of just having a linear gradient, I have a bunch of different colors with varying darks and lights so that I can really mix it up and create a nice depth so that all this metal on the armored model still remains visually interesting. The first color I'm going to add is a really dark green blue, a sort of deep, stormy color that will act as the darkest color on our metal, making sure to really get in there and get solid coverage on all parts of the model. I then use a similar color that was slightly lighter in value and applied it on top while the paint was still wet, mixing it into the visible areas, leaving the darkest color in the hard to reach spots and shadowy areas. Next, I'm going to be applying my darkest of the magentas. This is sort of the beginning of the midtones, so it's a jump up in value as well as a change of color. With this, I'm going to start establishing the foundations of the lighting, so picking out where the light would be prominent on areas like the shoulder pads, around the face, and that big cool detail on the stomach or belt area. And as I add a lighter version of the magenta, I sort of realize that maybe this is getting a little bit too colorful, so instead, for my next jump up in value, I just make a gray with white and off black and add some magenta right to that. And this is a bit of a step up in value, but I need to really start pushing that contrast. And since there's such a difference, it's kind of streaky when I first apply it, but as long as I stay vigilant with my dry brushing, I can sort of buff it away and really blend it in nicely, creating a smooth gradient. As I continue to push the contrast and increase the value, I switch over to more warm yellowish hues. And it's important to not just get the tops or peaks of things, but like on areas such as the shoulders, I'm getting the corners near the face and chest too, since that would be picking up some of the reflection when viewed from the front. And getting multiple points on one area to a high value helps to also add that really high contrast and reflective look to the metal. Just ignore those wild layer lines from the 3D print. And another thing that really helps it look like a metallic and reflective object is to not render the whole miniature the same way. For example, the feet should be way less bright than the tops of the shoulders, since the feet are further away from the light source and overall more shadowed than something at the top of the model. Also, since we're sort of pushing the light to be more from his right, our left, that side of the model would also be brighter. Like the knees, for example. The same color that is used to render the bright one is only used to sort of edge highlight the other. Thinking of the whole miniature as one object helps with the realism, with more shadow towards the bottom, instead of each little section all rendered and painted with the same steps. And so far I was really happy with it. I think this would be a great base to then go in with a more typical brush, just to be able to finesse the details, but the overall thesis of the video is to do it all with dry brushing, and as of right now, it really needs that extra oomph of contrast and for the value to be pushed even higher. There's also some dead areas in the midtones between the brights and the darks, so I mix up a desaturated blue and target those areas, varying up the gradients and making more of the edges stick out like they're catching the light. When it comes to adding the really bright off-whites, I'm trying to really push the value to create high reflections, but also be sparse with it, making sure the previous color is showing so that it looks natural, which is a bit tricky to do with just dry brushing. I'm using a small part of my flat brush and trying to just feather a small area, slowly building up the color, hitting just the very edges and peaks of sharp corners and that stomach detail. This is of course easier said than done, so I did have to do a bit of back and forth, covering some areas back up and fixing mistakes with darker colors. Overall, I think this added some nice depth though, and I'm pretty excited at the result I was able to get. Contrast is really king here, so it was cool that by just pushing that and being intentional, we could capture a metallic look with just dry brushing. I think it was really successful and super approachable, which makes me really happy and hopefully helps to demystify non-metallic metals a bit. I'm also really happy with the color choices. Since this whole thing was going to be rendered as the same type of metal, I wanted to make sure that it still had some nuance and interest, and I think the colors were the right choice. Looking at the finished result though, I do think I could have been even bolder and pushed those a bit more, since they got pretty faded with that last big push for value I did, which introduced a lot of neutrality, but I think this is the better choice for a tutorial video, since it can always be altered and tweaked to your liking. I did feel a little limited though, just because there were some areas I couldn't quite get to with my brush, like around the base of and in between all those spikes, but overall I thought this was super fun and turned out really well, especially since in actual practice I think you'd be using a mix of techniques, so if this is what you can get with just dry brushing, imagine what just some touch-ups with a typical brush could do. Thanks for watching.